Today we're going to be building the Master Grade Force Impulse Gundam. This is going to be part 1 of my first resin conversion series where we're going to focus on the build of the plastic kit and the conversion for the legs. Now, resin kits have a notoriety for being more difficult and are usually marketed towards the higher and more experienced builders. So after messing up my first resin kit, I wanted to share with you guys my thoughts on what I've learned through my first resin kit as I go through my second one, and I wanted to share with you guys some tips and some tricks for you guys to get started on your first resin kit. Now, before we can even begin on the resin kit, we actually need to start with the base kit. Some people like to skip the initial snap build and go straight into paint preparation. However, for resin kits, you need the initial assembly to make sure that the conversion kit pieces actually fit on your kit. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started on the snap kit of the Force Impulse Gundam. Now that the kit is assembled, we can actually begin working on the resin piece. For this section, I'm going to talk about what I actually did in this video and what I wish I had done instead after we go through everything that I've done. After initial review of all the pieces in the box to make sure there aren't any breaks or missing pieces, I went ahead and emptied them all out and prepped them for the bath. Now, unlike plastic kits, resin pieces are going to have a release agent still attached to them, so we're going to need to go ahead and get that off. From my communication with other experienced resin kit builders, I decided on using purple power because it was what was available to me. However, I hear simple green works too. Be sure to just check out what other people may say and find whichever one works best for you. After an overnight soak in the purple power, be sure to give them a rinse off with some cool soapy water. You want to avoid hot water as that can tend to make the resin pieces a little bit softer and can lead to some potential warping if you're not careful. Once you've washed off all the degreaser and all the soapy water, lay your pieces out to dry so we can move on to the next step. At this point, this is where I realized I made a mistake. Now, with all the pieces dry in a nice pile, it's time to begin separating them out. And while the bigger pieces are easier to find, some of the smaller pieces were harder to differentiate where they belong. For future reference, I think it would be better if I went ahead and separated the pieces before I put them into the bath. This way I don't have to play Where's Waldo with the tiniest event pieces, and I can itemize all the pieces on the manual before they go into the bath. So now that the leg pieces are identified, let's go ahead and get them cleaned up for assembly. Now, unlike polystyrene used in Gunpla pieces, resin is a little bit different in terms of its actual properties. Resin is tougher, but that makes it a little bit more brittle and risks breaking instead of bending when it comes to cutting your pieces out. For this reason, I went ahead and got myself some dedicated resin nippers, and much like when you're working with your Gunpla pieces, you want to cut them out a little bit at a time to avoid putting any stress on the piece and ultimately cracking the piece instead of the gate that you're trying to remove. Once you cut them down to an acceptable area, it's time to go ahead and get them prepped for sanding and surface prep for our paints. Now, this next bit is very important. Resin dust is extremely toxic. You don't want to be breathing any of this stuff in because short-term exposure can cause a sore throat and maybe a little bit of irritation and shortness of breath. Long-term exposure can lead to some permanent damage to your lungs. Because of this, I highly recommend using a respirator or go into some wet sanding to make sure that that dust doesn't get out and into the air that you can breathe. One thing that helps is to set up a vacuum on your desk. The one that I have here is the Hobby Mio desktop dust collector, but I'm also running my Airbrush fan in the back just to get a little bit of extra suction in case I miss any of that dust. Once that was done, I went ahead and vacuumed the area because I want to make sure that none of the dust that may have settled in the carpet can be sniffed up by any of my dogs. With our pieces cleaned up, it's time for our test fit assembly. Now, for some of the pieces, they may attach directly to the frame, others may still require some glue in order for it to be held in place. Because this is a temporary assembly, I'll go ahead and snap in any pieces that I can, and any additional pieces that require some extra help to be held on, I'll either go ahead and use some masking tape or some blue tack in order to hold it to where it belongs. As you go through this section, you'll realize that some pieces may need some adjustment in order to fit properly. Begin by working with some of the pieces that you already started with and continuing with whatever pattern you feel is best to get you down to where you need to be. Once you're happy with the fitment, it's time to move on to some paint. Now this is where I want to explain why I'm only focusing on the legs for this build. Resin kits have massive amounts of detail, and building one can seem like a daunting and overwhelming task, but that doesn't have to be the case. Like any huge project, like cleaning house, you start by breaking the task down into easier to manage chunks. In this case, I'm breaking the entire resin kit up into sections of the build, and if you watch any other resin builder, the process is going to be relatively the same, maybe just chunked out differently. Think back to the first kit that you painted too. It's unlikely that you painted the entire kit in one sitting, and even if you did, you probably organized it in a way that helped you to break up what paints to use for what pieces. Our brains naturally want to organize things to be more efficient, so do the same thing for your resin kits, and before you know it, you'll be on your way to completing your first kit. So with this knowledge, guys, please feel free to follow along with this tutorial. If you want to pick up a resin kit for yourself, head on over to the GundamPlaceStore.com, where you can go ahead and pick up your own resin conversion kit, as well as the base kit needed for the assembly. If you want any of the paints mentioned in this video, head on over to MidwestHobbyandCraft.com, where you can get a wonderful selection of the AOK Silver Oaks, Hobby Mio, and Splash paints to fit whatever painting needs that you guys have. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found some value in this video, and remember, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next one.